But without further ado, I think it's worth handing over to Ed Perrin, who's Development Director at Low Carbon, to provide us with a short presentation and to set the scene for today's discussion. So Ed, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome to you all. So my name is Ed Perrin, and I'm a Development Director at Low Carbon. Low Carbon is one of the I say leading. I've got some colleagues also on the panel who might disagree, but we're certainly one of the biggest UK developers of solar projects. And since 2020, we've secured about 30 planning permissions in England and Wales, and hopefully have more to come in the near future. The sites we have secured permission for range anywhere in size from 20 megawatts, which is about 60 acres in size, all the way up to our recently approved Gate Burton nationally significant infrastructure project in Lincolnshire, which is nearly 1,600 acres. So suffice to say that site selection is something that we have a pretty good deal of perspective on, and hopefully our track record means that we get it right more often than not. So it's obviously no secret that the government has very ambitious plans for solar, of which utility scale projects have a critical role to play. In simple terms, the volume of sites required from around the country is vast. And as such, it's essential that as developers, we're very robust in our processes to ensure that we're not promoting bad projects that are either not technically viable or commercially viable, or have no chance of being approved, and ultimately, you know, that's no good for anyone. So today I'll take a few minutes to run through some of the things that we consider when taking a project forward, along with some of the challenges which don't always make that possible. And I think the message that I would have for you today is, when a project gets to the point at which we take it through the planning process, it can be months or possibly years to get to that point. So it's not something that is done quickly. But I look forward to answering some of your questions at the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. So fundamentally, the main driver behind the siting of solar projects is the presence of a viable grid connection. Obviously, our fuel is the sun, so that goes without saying. But generally, in the UK countryside, there isn't really places where there isn't sun. So that's sort of a given in the site selection process. So next we look to a viable grid connection. The UK grid it was designed to take power from large concentrated thermal power plants and distribute it through a network of lines and substations to where it's ultimately consumed in towns and cities and through industry, etc. As a consequence, we really have two tiers of grid in the country. So we have the transmission network, which is the image on the left-hand side of the screen, and they are your 275 and 400 kV networks, so the big pylons, and they're what we call the dual carriageways and the motorways of the national grid. They're the backbone of our electricity system. And this in turn is transformed down into the distribution network. So within the country, we have distribution network operators, and they each operate a region of the country and manage the distribution of electricity from those transmission hubs into sort of the poles and the lines that ultimately feed homes and businesses in local areas. Importantly, the network it was designed to take power from concentrated central locations and distribute it out in terms of businesses. It generally wasn't designed to put power into it at a distribution level, and that's one of the challenges that we face, but we'll come on to that a bit later. So next slide, please. So what this network looks like on the ground is a potential network of things that we can connect to. So at the lower voltages on the left-hand side of the screen, we have wooden poles and primary substations. So these are substations generally on the edge of towns and villages. They're relatively small, and these are cheap to connect to, and they don't take very long. It's relatively simple process to connect into one of those lines or substations. However, the issue is there are limits to how much power we can export into these lines and substations. So they are limited by what they were designed to accommodate, which is generally low levels of power to distribute to the sort of local houses and villages and things in the area. So it's great if you can secure a connection, but generally you can't put very much in, if that makes sense. Also, because of where these sort of lower voltage networks are, they're generally quite isolated. So injecting power into them can generally have upstream consequences. So while it's simple to connect here, it will have need upgrades elsewhere on the network, and those can be very expensive and often take a very long time. So I think the opportunities to connect into infrastructure at this voltage are generally now diminishing. They were very popular back in between 2010 and 2015, but generally they're like entities. To be quite frank, it's really difficult to find one of these offers that doesn't have some constraint in some way, shape, or form. So that moves us sort of along to the right-hand side of the slide, where we have the higher voltage, the higher voltage network. So the 132 kV, that still sits at the distribution network level, but these are big pylons, big metal pylons, big substations. So that substation in the center at the bottom is called a bulk supply point. So these are about 1 to 2 acres in size. So generally big infrastructure. The connection timescales tend to be much longer. So, and the costs are obviously much higher. I think the other thing about these grid interfaces is there's generally a lot of nervousness to putting lots and lots of connections into these overhead lines with these substations, because what that does is it upsets the network. So generally what we find is that there is opportunities to connect into these 132 kV lines, but they are generally beset by the need to undertake reinforcements or which generally takes some time and costs quite a lot of money. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see, back one slide, sorry, Rachel. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the transmission network. These are the 400 kV monster pylons. This is operated and managed by the National Grid. The substation on the bottom is one of the biggest substations in the country. It's about 16 acres in size, so absolutely vast scale. The pylons that at the top are obviously the biggest pylons you'll see. These types of connections are generally restricted to nationally significant infrastructure projects, so DCOs, huge scale, generally thousands of acres in size. And that's simply because it will take you 4 years to connect the project, excluding any upgrades that may be required on the network. And it's generally extremely expensive, so just prohibitive for the type of project that would be considered at a local planning authority level. Generally, the connection voltage impacts two things. One is the site size. So obviously, if you're connecting into the local distribution network, the costs are smaller, so therefore the projects can be smaller by very nature. So there's fixed costs, so we can generally accommodate smaller projects in these local areas where you're connecting into the poles and the small substations. Obviously, as I mentioned, we're connecting generally DCOs on the transmission network, so those need to be of huge scale to be able to accommodate the very high fixed costs. It also impacts on site search areas. So generally, if we're connecting at much higher voltages, we can't have vast amounts of underground cabling or overhead lines. So we need to be located quite close to where the grid is, and that limits our search area for sites. At the lower level, at the distribution level, we can generally accommodate a much wider search area because the cost of underground cabling is generally can be accommodated on a project of that scale. So generally, we see projects distributed a little bit further from those 33 or 11 kV lines. So as such, once we've identified a potential grid interface somewhere where we can connect the project, it's necessary to determine a site search area within which to review potential sites. So next slide, please. So once we've identified our site area, we will then look and see what other planning and land use constraints that exist within that search area. So generally, if we're connecting in at a lower voltage, we might, as I say, have a slightly wider search area. So you can see an image on the screen. This is an actual site that has gone through planning, and we were looking to connect into a 33 kV substation. So we drew a 5 kilometer radius around that substation, and we looked at all potential locations that could accommodate a solar farm within that area. So these are, we would generally overlay GIS resources, so spatial data. We'll review local plans for supportive policies or anything that would restrict development within that area. And we also undertake site visits just to have a look on the ground and make sure that there's nothing that's missed in the data. So the following things we typically consider: we look at national and local planning policy, accessibility. Obviously, this will need to be built. So from a construction perspective, we'll need to get vehicles in and out. There's obviously a preference for previously developed land or industrial settings. So we will look to see whether there's any sites being promoted that might be available for this type of development. Agricultural land quality, we had a previous session on that. Some of you may have joined, looking at agricultural land classifications, ensuring that we're avoiding the best quality land. Also looking at other sort of softer impacts like visual impacts, proximity to sensitive landscapes or areas of designated environmental significance, such as triple SIs, SACs, SPAs, things of that nature. Flood risk, again, flood risk is not a prohibitive constraint, but it's something that we do seek to avoid. And lastly, historic environment impacts, so any listed buildings, scheduled monuments that we could impact. Now, clearly, at this point where we're looking at a wide area, we can't assess each individual, we can't assess the setting of a listed building, every listed building within that search area. But what it can do is give us a proxy for where we're likely to see the greatest impacts within that search area, and look to try and identify a site that obviously, from our perspective, we want a smooth ride through planning. So a site that has the least environmental impacts, or a site that can be justified in planning terms, but that isn't going to have unacceptable environmental impacts. But obviously, we might find a technical site, but if you skip forward to the next slide, that doesn't necessarily mean the land's available. So we generally need to look at all sites that have the potential for a project, and then go through a process to identify if it's available. So it might be suitable, but it might not be available. So we will undertake technical assessments of sites. Is it physically suitable, topography, field size, field pattern, etc. But often we can't even get the landowners on the phone. We have people within our team whose job it is to knock on doors and things. But even then, sometimes people just aren't interested. They're just simply not. They're farmers. They're just not willing to put their land into a solar farm for potentially 40 years. So that's where we need to also look at things like legal encumbrances, the land options. We often get a lot of interest, but then once we scratch beneath the surface, there might be some restriction, a land option that the landowner signed on the back of an envelope a few years ago that signed the land up for 40 years, but it's simply not available, even though they want to do it. Are there any previous uses, such as mining or dumping on the site, that would, in theory, cause us issues in terms of the warranty of our, these are power plants that ultimately, at the end of the day, if you get a lot of subsidence or settlement within the site, that can cause damage to the equipment. So we need to think through the practical considerations. And then also, often in these cases, you might find that you don't have one landowner who's interested. It maybe multiple landowners. So then it's the land assembly exercise to identify who, how you can piece together all of the different parcels that are interested with the land you have available to create a site that is commercially viable. Now, assuming you can get through all these points and you can get a landowner to sign a letter of intent, so you can submit a grid application, that is just the first part of the process. So it's only once you've submitted that grid offer that you have any right to secure a grid connection within that area. So you might have agreed terms with the landowner, but it's only once you get that grid offer back from the distribution network or the transmission network where they say, yes, you can connect the project, this is when you can connect it, and this is how much it's going to cost, that you have a real live project that you can take forward. But that's still not where the challenge is lying. I'm very, very negative. This is where we earn our salt. But if you click forward to the next slide. So there are still challenges. That process historically was quite a straightforward process. There was generally people were interested. The policy was supportive for sites of a small scale. There was grid capacity available. Now we're in a new era where the demand for sites in this country is so great that actually now the grid capacity is one of our key constraints. It's a highly constrained network. I mentioned before just how the grid is structured to take power from big central power stations down to the local network level. We're now looking to put power in all over the network, and that's extremely challenging for distribution networks and for the transmission network to accommodate all of these different injections of power into the network. Often grid offers are prohibitively expensive, or they have extremely long timescales, and that can just that can end up meaning that, quite simply put, we have to cancel the project, and we get high attrition at that initial stage, high amounts of projects that we've got. At that point, we've got landowners interested, but they just ultimately we have to walk away from the project. There's also grid rules. Once you have a project and you've applied for the grid, you can't just move it somewhere else. You have to stay there. So often what we find is that the policy context or that we find something out through archaeological investigations or other detailed site surveys that we could not have known at the time. And then what the impact of that means that often that site may become extremely challenging to build, but we are unable to move it somewhere else. Or we would have to apply for a new grid offer and go to the back of the queue, and potentially lose years and a lot of money in the process. And also planning changes. Clearly, this process takes a long time, and we're typically in planning at the minute for projects that we applied for grid 2, 3, 4 years ago. That's how long it takes for sites to get from initial site inception stage through to a live planning application. So it's a challenge. I think from our perspective, what we want to do is to be able to demonstrate to local authorities that it is a process we have to go through. It's not straightforward. So often we have to deal with the constraints that are within the site at a real level through design iterations, through liaising with consultees, and it's not simply the case that we can just move the site somewhere else. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context as to what happens before we get to planning, and I'll hand back to Gareth and Rachel now for any questions and answers.